We have always pictured our ancient ancestors in our own image. For generations, artists and scientists reconstructed the faces of Europe's first peoples based on bones and ancient art, assuming they shared our modern features. But a revolution is rewriting this story, one strand of genetic code at a time. Newly sequenced ancient DNA is shattering every assumption about what the original Europeans really looked like. By the end of this journey, you will see a portrait of the past so different it will change how you see human history itself. This is not just about skin or eye color. It is a detective story written in genes, revealing epic migrations, forgotten peoples, and a truth far stranger than the myths. How could someone with dark skin and blue eyes walk the frozen tundra of ancient Britain? What cataclysmic wave of people brought the first light skin to the continent? The answers lie buried in bones, waiting for science to listen. What do you truly know about the face in your own distant mirror? For centuries, the past was a silhouette. Archaeologists held ancient skulls in their hands, tracing the curve of a brow ridge, the width of a nasal opening. They studied statues and cave paintings, searching for hints in the ochre lines drawn by long-vanished hands. These methods built the first foundational sketches of our ancestors. They could tell us a person was tall or that they had a strong jaw. They revealed the cultural story through artifacts, beads for adornment, tools for daily life. But these sources share a profound and silent limitation. They are utterly mute on the question of color. A skeleton cannot tell you if its owner had freckles, or eyes the color of a stormy sea, or hair as dark as a midnight forest. Pigmentation, the very palette of a human face, is written not in bone but in genes. Classical art offers clues, but they are cultural choices, not photographic records. The pigments used in ancient frescoes fade or change over millennia. An artistic style often idealized figures rather than documenting them with realistic accuracy. This left a giant, colorful blank in the middle of every reconstruction. We could assemble the architecture of the face, but we had to guess at the paint. So for generations, we filled in those blanks with our own assumptions, often projecting the familiar features of modern Europeans onto people who lived thousands of years earlier. It was a logical but ultimately flawed act of imagination. To move beyond guesswork, science needed to find a way to read the original blueprint, the biological instructions that determined appearance from the moment of conception. The answer lay hidden deep within the very bones themselves, in a molecule so fragile its secrets were thought to be lost to time: ancient DNA. The first brushstrokes on this ancient canvas belonged to a people who arrived when Europe was a different world. Around 45,000 years ago, as glaciers still gripped much of the continent, the first modern humans, often called the Cro-Magnons, made their home in this challenging landscape. For decades, we saw them through a cultural lens, depicted as rugged, pale-skinned hunters bundled in furs against the cold, a vision born more from our own environment than from theirs. But their DNA tells a radically different story. Genetic analysis of individuals from this deep time reveals a stunning portrait. The key genes associated with light skin pigmentation in modern Europeans, such as one called SLC24A5, were simply not present in these ancient genomes. The evidence points overwhelmingly to a conclusion that reshapes our mental image. These pioneering Europeans almost certainly had dark skin. Their hair was likely dark as well. Yet in a fascinating twist of genetic history, some carried a variant of the HERC2 gene strongly associated with blue eyes. This combination, dark skin with piercing blue eyes, is exceptionally rare in the world today, and it paints a picture of ancient Europe that feels both alien and intimately human. This was not a disadvantage in their environment. Their dark skin was an ancestral trait carried from humanity's African origins, and it offered protection against intense ultraviolet radiation, which could still be a factor even in colder climates. They were supremely adapted to a life of movement, tracking herds of mammoth and reindeer across the vast, open steppes. They created breathtaking art in the depths of caves, not as primitive doodles, but as profound expressions of a rich symbolic world. The classic pale-skinned caveman is a myth. The reality was a diverse, resilient people whose appearance defies our simplest categories, a first clue that the story of European ancestry is far from a straight, predictable line. The portrait of dark-skinned, blue-eyed hunters is not an artist's fantasy, but a conclusion drawn from cold, hard data. This leap from educated guess to genetic fact marks one of the most profound shifts in our understanding of the past. It was made possible by a new scientific discipline, archaeogenetics, a field that merges the meticulous digging of archaeology with the precise code reading of genetics. For decades, the idea of extracting usable DNA from bones thousands of years old seemed like science fiction. The molecule degrades over time, shattering into tiny fragments and becoming contaminated by the DNA of every microbe, plant, and modern human who has ever touched the sample. Reading it was like trying to reconstruct a shredded encyclopedia after it had been left in the rain. The breakthrough came with next-generation sequencing, a revolutionary technology that allows scientists to read millions of these tiny genetic fragments at once, and powerful computer algorithms that can then piece them back together, filtering out the contamination to rebuild the original ancient genome. Think of it as the ultimate forensic tool, a way to listen to whispers from the past that were once inaudible. This technology does not just tell us who was related to whom, it lets us read the specific genetic instructions, the alleles, that governed a person's physical appearance. We can now look at the genes for melanin production and make a statistical prediction about skin tone. We can identify the variants responsible for eye color, and even hair texture. It transforms the question of what did they look like from a speculative puzzle into a calculation of probabilities, grounded in the very biology of the individual. This is not about replacing the archaeologist's trowel, but about giving it a voice. The bones provide the framework, but the DNA provides the paint, allowing us to see our ancestors not as monolithic stereotypes, but as distinct individuals with a biological story written in every cell. This genetic portrait of Europe's first people remained remarkably stable for thousands of years. Then, a revolution arrived not with a sword, but with a seed. Around 8,000 years ago, a profound new chapter began as a wave of people migrated from the region of Anatolia in modern-day Turkey, bringing with them a technology that would forever alter the land and its inhabitants' agriculture. This was not a sudden invasion, but a slow, relentless tide of change, moving northwest along river valleys and coastlines over generations. These Neolithic farmers carried a completely different genetic signature from the indigenous hunter-gatherers, a signature that reveals the second major act in the story of the European face. Their DNA tells us they were genetically more closely related to populations from the Near East, and they brought with them a suite of traits that would begin to lighten the continent's palate. Analysis of their genomes shows they carried versions of skin pigmentation genes associated with lighter skin tones than the local hunter-gatherers possessed. This adaptation may have been linked to their new way of life. Farming meant a more settled existence with a diet richer in grains but potentially lower in vitamin D, which our bodies produce when sunlight hits our skin. In the less intense sunlight of northern latitudes, lighter skin allows for more efficient vitamin D synthesis, a possible advantage for these new communities. Their eyes were likely brown and their hair dark. Imagine the scene along the frontiers of this expansion. A dark-skinned, blue-eyed hunter-gatherer standing at the edge of a forest, watching as a community of lighter-skinned farmers cleared land, planted crops, and built permanent homes. This was more than a cultural clash. It was the meeting of two distinct human lineages, two separate branches of the human tree that had been evolving apart for millennia, now coming face to face on the same soil. The farmers did not simply replace the hunters. For centuries, even millennia, the two populations existed side by side, a Europe of two worlds. Genetic studies show limited mixing at first, but over time their stories began to weave together. The arrival of these Anatolian farmers represents the first major, deliberate reshaping of Europe's genetic landscape, introducing not just new crops and tools, but the very genes that would become a foundational layer of the modern European population. The stage was now set for an even more dramatic and violent act in this ancient play, one that would arrive from the vast eastern steppes and change everything once again. The quiet mingling of farmers and hunters was shattered by a force from the east. Around 5,000 years ago, from the vast, windswept grasslands north of the Black Sea, a new people emerged with a power that would echo for millennia. These were the Yamnaya, pastoralists of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, and their arrival was less a migration and more a genetic tsunami. They did not arrive on foot with seeds, but on wagons and horseback with herds. Their mastery of the wheel and the domesticated horse gave them a mobility and reach that previous cultures could scarcely comprehend. They were not settlers looking for farmland, but expansive pastoralists moving with their animals across incredible distances, and their genetic signature reveals a people perfectly adapted to their world. Analysis of Yamnaya DNA shows they carried a very high probability of lighter skin, a trait that likely became widespread in their population. Their eye color varied, but included a significant frequency of lighter shades like blue and green, while their hair was predominantly darker. This combination created a look that is, for the first time in our story, recognizably familiar to the modern European eye. But their true legacy is not in their appearance alone, it is in the sheer, overwhelming scale of their genetic impact. When researchers compare ancient DNA to modern populations, they find a staggering fact. The Yamnaya contribution to the ancestry of modern Northern Europeans is immense, often estimated at up to 50% or more. In some regions, it is even higher. This was not a gentle blending. The genetic data suggests a period of rapid, large-scale population turnover. The existing communities of farmers and the remaining hunter-gatherers did not simply absorb the newcomers. In many areas, the Yamnaya ancestry largely replaced what was there before. How did this happen? The archaeological record shows signs of profound social change and, in some places, conflict. The Yamnaya were hierarchical, with powerful chieftains buried under great mounds called kurgans, accompanied by weapons, gold, and sometimes entire wagons. They also brought with them the ancestral language that would eventually evolve into most of the languages spoken in Europe today, from English to Greek to Sanskrit. Their expansion was the final, defining act in the genetic formation of ancient Europe. They wove together the threads of the earlier peoples, but their own thread was the strongest, the boldest color in the new tapestry. The face of the continent was transformed, not by the slow creep of agriculture, but by the swift, decisive movement of people on horseback, carrying with them a new social order, a new language, and the dominant genetic blueprint for the Europe that was to come. But how do we know any of this? How can a scientist look at a list of letters from a broken strand of DNA and confidently say this person had dark skin or blue eyes? The answer lies in a handful of key genes, the biological switches that control our appearance. By learning to read them, we can watch the story of European pigmentation unfold across millennia. One of the most important genes for skin tone is called SLC24A5. Think of it as a factory manager for melanin, the pigment that colors our skin, hair, and eyes. Everyone carries 2 copies of this gene, one from each parent. The specific version or allele you inherit determines the factory's output. The ancestral allele, common in African populations and carried by Europe's first hunter-gatherers, results in higher melanin production and darker skin. But a single, tiny change in this gene's code, a variant known as the allele, dramatically reduces melanin production. This is the light skin variant. We can track its journey. In the ancient DNA record, it is virtually absent in the earliest Europeans. We then see it appear at low frequencies in the incoming Anatolian farmers. But its real explosion across the continent coincides perfectly with the arrival of the Yamnaya from the steppes, who carried it at nearly 100% frequency. Another gene, SLC45A2, tells a similar story, its light skin alleles spreading in tandem. This is not one gene acting alone, but a symphony of genetic changes, each playing a part in adapting to new environments and diets. For eye color, the spotlight falls on a gene called OCA2 and a nearby regulator named HERC2. A specific change in the HERC2 gene effectively blocks the pathway for brown melanin in the iris, allowing the underlying blue color to show through. This fascinating variant was already present, as we saw, in some of the dark-skinned hunter-gatherers, a striking reminder that traits can evolve independently. Hair color adds another layer of complexity, governed by genes like MC1R. Different variants here can lead to red hair, blonde hair, or various shades of brown and black. The spread of these alleles didn't happen all at once. They moved through ancient populations at different speeds, driven by chance, by the advantages they may have offered, and by the simple fact that the people who carried them were successful, raising large families whose genes would shape future generations. Reading these genetic markers is like watching a time lapse of human history, where the rise and fall of alleles maps the invisible migrations and meetings of entire peoples. The mosaic of ancient Europe was painted not by a single brush, but by countless individual lives, each contributing one tiny, colorful piece to the grand portrait of the past. The abstract symphony of genes finds its most striking soloist in a single 10,000-year-old skeleton from a cave in southwest England. Discovered over a century ago in Go's Cave, near the village of Cheddar, this individual, known as Cheddar Man, was long considered a textbook example of early British ancestry. For generations, museum displays and history books reconstructed him with pale skin and light eyes, a presumed ancient forefather of the modern English. But when a team of scientists finally sequenced his ancient DNA, the portrait that emerged was a revelation that made headlines around the world. The genetic analysis was remarkably detailed, reading the key markers for pigmentation. The data revealed that Cheddar Man had a very high probability of dark to black skin. His eyes were most likely blue, his hair was dark and probably curly. This was not a tentative suggestion, but a confident conclusion drawn from the same genetic code that once guided the cells of his body. Here was a man whose physical appearance would be profoundly uncommon in Britain today, yet he was genetically a direct ancestor of the island's earliest post-glacial population. The impact of this finding rippled far beyond academic journals. It forced a dramatic and public reconsideration of deep national identity. The classic image of the ancient Briton, often subconsciously pictured as a ruddy-complexioned, light-eyed figure, was instantly dismantled. Cheddar Man became a powerful symbol, a tangible reminder that the concepts of indigenous and what a people should look like are fluid across the vast expanse of time. His story underscores a crucial point made by the broader genetic data. The light skin tone now common in Northern Europe is not an ancient, immutable feature of the land, but a relatively recent arrival, woven into the population by later migrations like those of the Yamnaya. Cheddar Man represents a world before that genetic wave, a snapshot of a much older Europe that survived the Ice Age. He hunted and gathered in a landscape that was still connected to the continent, a place of forests and rivers that would one day become an island. His DNA connects him more closely to other Mesolithic hunter-gatherers from Spain and Luxembourg than to the farmers or steppe herders who would follow. He is a ghost from a lost chapter, a man whose very appearance asks us to question the stories we tell ourselves about origin and belonging. His reconstructed face, with its dark skin and bright blue gaze, now looks out from museum displays not as an oddity, but as a testament to a forgotten reality, a living piece of evidence that the first chapters of human history were painted in colors far more diverse than we ever dared to imagine. The genetic wave from the steppe did not stop with the Yamnaya themselves. Their legacy was carried forward by their cultural and biological descendants, who spread their influence across the continent like ripples in a pond. Two of the most significant ripples were the corded ware and bell beaker peoples, cultures that defined much of Europe's Bronze Age. When scientists extracted DNA from their ancient remains, the genetic story was unmistakable. These individuals carried a very high proportion of Yamnaya ancestry, often between 70 and 90%. They were, in a very real sense, the children of the steppe, and their physical appearance reflected this powerful inheritance. The genetic markers tell us that the people of these widespread cultures predominantly had lighter skin tones, a trait inherited directly from their Yamnaya forebears. Their eye color presented a fascinating mix, with a strong tendency toward lighter shades like blue, green, and hazel, though darker brown eyes were still present. Hair color varied across a spectrum from dark brown to lighter browns, with occasional genetic variants for blonde or red hair appearing in the mix. This paints a picture of populations that were beginning to look much more like modern Northern Europeans, a direct result of that ancient steppe migration solidified over generations. This was not a static population, but a highly mobile one. The corded ware culture, named for the distinctive cord-impressed pottery found in their single graves, expanded rapidly from regions north of the Black Sea into Central and Northern Europe. They were semi-nomadic pastoralists herding cattle and sheep, and their mobility was written into their burial practices and their genes. The bell beaker phenomenon is even more intriguing, defined by a specific style of ornate drinking vessel that appears from the Iberian Peninsula to the British Isles. For a long time, archaeologists debated whether this represented a spread of ideas, a trade network, or an actual movement of people. Ancient DNA provided a decisive answer. In Britain, for example, the arrival of bell beaker artifacts around 4,500 years ago coincides with a genetic turnover of nearly 90% of the existing population. The people buried with these beakers carried high levels of steppe ancestry. They were newcomers, and they brought with them not just new pottery but a new genetic reality. Their physical traits were intertwined with their way of life. A lighter skin tone, now widespread in these northern latitudes, may have been advantageous for a lifestyle that, while pastoral, still relied on outdoor activity and a diet that required efficient vitamin D synthesis. Their mobility, facilitated by ongoing use of wagons and horses, meant these genetic signatures were not confined to one valley or tribe. They were carried along trade routes across rivers and over mountain passes, creating a surprisingly interconnected Bronze Age world. When you look at a map of bell beaker finds from the sun-drenched coasts of Portugal to the misty highlands of Scotland, you are not just looking at the spread of a pottery style. You are looking at the footprints of a people on the move, a genetic tide that reshaped the face of a continent. The individual holding that beaker was likely a person of lighter skin, with eyes that could be blue or brown, whose ancestors had trekked thousands of miles from the eastern grasslands. Their story is one of incredible resilience and adaptation, a testament to how a single powerful migration can echo for thousands of years, defining not only culture and language, but the very color of a people's skin and eyes. This genetic portrait of the Bronze Age reveals a continent transformed, yet the echoes of an older world still whisper from the shadows. Among the most haunting and beautiful of these echoes is the story of two brothers who lived and died long before farmers or herders ever set foot on their land. In 2006, in a deep, cold cave high in the mountains of northern Spain called La Braña, archaeologists discovered the remarkably well-preserved remains of two men. They were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers dating back around 7,000 years, a time when the descendants of Europe's first pioneers still thrived in isolated pockets. When scientists sequenced their ancient DNA, they expected to confirm the now familiar image of dark-skinned Europeans. What they did not expect was the specific, startling detail written in their genes. Both individuals carried the genetic variant for blue eyes. Here, in the sun-drenched landscapes of Iberia, walked men with dark skin and eyes the color of a pale winter sky. This discovery, alongside similar findings from other Western European hunter-gatherer sites, presents a captivating enigma. It tells us that the trait for blue eyes evolved in Europe independently from the genes for light skin. For thousands of years, these two features were not linked. They traveled on separate genetic journeys carried by different populations living vastly different lives. The blue eye allele likely arose from a single, random mutation in one individual living near the Black Sea sometime after the initial migration out of Africa. This mutation spread, perhaps by chance or because it was favored in some way, through the hunter-gatherer populations of Europe long before the light-skin alleles became common. Why would this trait persist? Scientists have proposed several intriguing ideas. In the dim light of dense forests or during the long twilight of northern winters, blue eyes may have offered a subtle advantage in social communication, making pupil dilation and emotional cues easier for close kin to read. Or perhaps it was simply a matter of preference, a trait considered attractive within small, tightly knit bands, leading those who carried it to have more children. Its survival highlights a profound truth about human evolution. Not every widespread trait needs a dramatic survival of the fittest explanation. Sometimes beauty or chance can shape our biology just as powerfully as the environment. The Braña brothers are a window into a lost aesthetic, a reminder that the ancient world was filled with combinations of appearance that our modern eyes rarely see. Their existence shatters the assumption that all physical traits evolve in a single, coordinated package. It shows us a Europe where the palette of human diversity was arranged in patterns we can scarcely recognize today, a testament to the long, winding, and often surprising paths our ancestors walked. The story of our skin is a map of survival written in sunlight. The evolution of lighter skin tones in Europe is one of the most profound examples of adaptation in human history, but its narrative is far more complex than a simple north-south gradient. For decades, the dominant explanation focused on a single, powerful driver, vitamin D. Our bodies produce this essential nutrient when ultraviolet B rays from the sun penetrate our skin. Melanin, the pigment that gives skin its color, acts as a natural sunscreen, protecting against DNA damage but also reducing vitamin D synthesis. In the intense sunlight near the equator, this protection is vital. But as humans migrated into northern latitudes with weaker, seasonal sunlight, a problem emerged. A diet based on hunting and foraging, while rich in some nutrients, is typically low in vitamin D. The theory suggests that natural selection favored individuals with lighter skin, which allowed more efficient vitamin D production in limited sunlight, preventing debilitating conditions like rickets and supporting reproductive health. It is a compelling, logical story of environmental pressure shaping our biology. Yet, the genetic timeline adds a fascinating twist. If this were a straightforward environmental adaptation, we would expect the light-skin alleles to have swept through the earliest northern populations, like those dark-skinned hunter-gatherers of ancient Britain, almost immediately. But they did not. The genetic evidence shows these variants remained rare or absent for thousands of years after humans settled in Europe. They only began their dramatic rise to near universality with the arrival of the Anatolian farmers and even more decisively the Yamnaya herders. This timing complicates the picture. It suggests that while vitamin D availability was likely a key factor, another force may have accelerated the change, a radical shift in diet. Farming brought a new way of life, but also a new nutritional challenge. Agricultural diets, heavy in grains like wheat and barley, are notoriously poor sources of vitamin D. Suddenly, a population living under northern skies was getting even less of this crucial nutrient from their food. The genetic predisposition for lighter skin, carried by these migrating farmers and then amplified by the Yamnaya, may have offered a critical advantage in this new context. It was not just about latitude anymore, it was about a complete cultural and dietary revolution that made a genetic trait overwhelmingly beneficial. But could there be another layer to this story? Some researchers propose that sexual selection, a cultural preference for lighter skin as a marker of beauty, health, or status, may have also played a role in amplifying these genetic changes once they appeared. While harder to trace in the archaeological record, the power of social choice in shaping our species is undeniable. The final portrait is one of intertwined forces. Environmental pressure set the stage, a dietary revolution created the urgency, and the massive demographic movements of the Neolithic and Bronze Ages delivered the genetic material for change on a continental scale. Our skin tells a story not just of sun and soil, but of seeds, herds, and the invisible currents of human preference that guided our evolution. The genetic story of our ancestors' hair is a tapestry woven from many threads, revealing a history of color far more recent and dynamic than we might assume. While the palette of ancient Europe was dominated by the deep shades of brown and black, the emergence of lighter hair colors marks a fascinating late chapter in our evolutionary story. For the hunter-gatherers of the deep past, and even for the first waves of Anatolian farmers, the genetic evidence points overwhelmingly toward dark hair. The key genes responsible, such as MC1R, predominantly carried variants that produce eumelanin, the pigment that colors hair dark brown to black. This makes perfect sense as the ancestral state for humanity, carried from our origins under the intense sun. But as populations settled, mixed, and adapted, new possibilities began to bloom from the genetic code. The shift toward lighter hair, particularly blonde, appears to be a surprisingly recent innovation in the grand scheme of human history. Genetic studies suggest that the specific suite of alleles responsible for classic Northern European blonde hair likely arose not in the Deep Ice Age, but much later, possibly during the Neolithic period or even the Bronze Age. One compelling hypothesis points to the region around the Baltic Sea as a potential cradle for this trait. Here, in a landscape of forests and coastlines, a combination of genetic drift, the small population sizes of isolated groups, and perhaps even cultural preference may have allowed a chance mutation to take root and spread. It was not a single gene, but a complex interplay of several that gradually turned down the production of dark eumelanin and allowed the underlying golden or reddish pheomelanin to shine through. This genetic signature did not stay confined to one corner of the map. It was carried along the same superhighways of migration that moved people and genes across the continent. Populations with significant ancestry from the Eastern European steppes, who themselves were a mix of earlier peoples, likely played a key role in distributing these blonde hair variants more widely as they moved westward and northward. Imagine a Bronze Age trading post where individuals with the dark hair common among Mediterranean farmers met others whose ancestry from the northern forests or eastern plains carried the newer genetic instructions for lighter locks. Every child born from such meetings was a living experiment in genetic combination, a shuffling of the deck that slowly introduced new shades into the population. Red hair tells its own, even more distinctive story. It is caused by a very specific recessive variant of the MC1R gene, often called the ginger allele. This mutation is ancient, with evidence suggesting it was present in some Neanderthals and early modern humans, but it has always been a rare spark in the genetic fire. Its expression requires inheriting the variant from both parents, which kept its frequency low. In ancient Europe, we find sporadic evidence of this gene. Notably, genetic testing of exceptionally well-preserved remains from the Bronze Age, such as individuals found in the arid deserts of Xinjiang in western China, has revealed carriers of these red hair alleles, showing how far the mobile steppe peoples had carried their genetic legacy. Yet, it never became a dominant trait in any major population. Its highest frequencies in the modern world are found in isolated pockets like Scotland and Ireland, where historical population bottlenecks and genetic drift allowed this once rare variant to become a celebrated part of the local heritage. The diversity of hair color we see today is not a primitive feature of humanity, but a relatively modern masterpiece of mixture and chance. It is a living record of thousands of years of encounters, migrations, and the quiet, persistent work of evolution, painting the human landscape in ever-shifting shades of darkness and light. But our appearance is more than just a surface of skin and hair. The genetic blueprint recovered from ancient bones offers whispers about the very architecture of the body, the height and build that shaped how these individuals moved through their world. One of the most consistent and striking patterns in the archaeological record is a dramatic shift in average height that coincides with the great migrations we have been tracing. For thousands of years, the hunter-gatherers of Europe were, on average, quite tall. Their lives of constant mobility, a protein-rich diet from hunting, and the genetic legacy of their deep ancestry all contributed to statuesque frames. Then, with the arrival of the first farmers, something changed. Skeletons from early agricultural communities show a noticeable decline in average height, a trend observed across the globe wherever farming took root. This was likely a consequence of their new diet, which could be less varied and more prone to failure, coupled with the challenges of settled living, including closer quarters and the spread of new illnesses. But the story takes another turn with the arrival of the Yamnaya from the steppes. Their remains and those of their descendants, like the corded were people, tell a different tale. These individuals were often remarkably tall, with some male burials revealing statures well over 6 feet. The genetic data provides a compelling explanation. The Yamnaya carried a specific set of genetic variants associated with increased height. When their ancestry spread explosively across northern Europe, they did not just bring lighter skin, they brought the biological potential for greater stature. This genetic legacy is still visible today with modern populations in northern Europe who carry the highest levels of this steppe ancestry, tending to be taller on average than those in southern Europe. It is a profound example of how a single, powerful migration can leave a physical imprint that lasts for millennia, written not in monuments but in the very skeletons of generations. Yet for all these insights, there is a frontier that ancient DNA has not yet fully conquered, the precise, individual shape of a face. While we can read the genes for pigmentation and make strong predictions about height, reconstructing the exact arrangement of features, the unique curve of a nose, the set of a jaw, the fullness of lips, from genetics alone remains a monumental challenge. Our facial structure is governed by a complex symphony of hundreds, perhaps thousands of genes, each with a tiny effect, all interacting in ways we are only beginning to understand. Environmental factors during development also play a significant role. This means that while we can say an ancient population had on average certain tendencies, we cannot yet look at one person's DNA and sculpt their unique visage with certainty. The stunning facial reconstructions you see in museums, like that of Cheddar Man, are therefore a careful fusion of science and art. The skull provides the foundational scaffold, the undeniable architecture. The DNA provides the crucial palette of skin, eye, and hair color, but the subtle details in between, the ones that transform a model into a believable human being, require the informed interpretation of a skilled artist, guided by anthropological data about population averages. This collaboration is where the cold data meets human empathy, allowing us to look into the eyes of a person 10,000 years gone. It reminds us that these were not just bundles of genetic traits, but individuals with expressions, with smiles and frowns that for now remain the quietest secret of the past. This genetic tapestry reveals a continent of astonishing diversity, not a single, uniform portrait. At the same moment in deep time, walking the same ancient earth, you would have encountered human appearances as varied as the landscapes themselves. Picture the westernmost edge of the continent in what is now Wales around 9,000 years ago. Here, in the damp oak forests and along the rugged coast, a community descended from the first pioneers thrived. A man from this group, genetically similar to Cheddar man, would have almost certainly possessed very dark skin, a trait carried from a much warmer ancestral home. His eyes, however, might have been a startling pale blue, a genetic signature that had traveled and persisted in these isolated bands. His hair was dark and likely curly, his build tall and lean from a life of tracking game and traversing difficult terrain. He was a living relic of the oldest layer of European ancestry. Now journey eastward to the fertile river valleys of central Germany a few thousand years later. The scene is utterly transformed. The forests have been partially cleared for fields of emmer wheat and barley. Here, a woman from an early farming community, her ancestry traced back to Anatolia, goes about her day. Her genetic profile tells a different story. Her skin tone is noticeably lighter than that of the Western hunter-gatherer, though not as pale as many modern Europeans. Her eyes are almost certainly a warm brown, and her hair is dark. She is shorter in stature, a consequence of her grain-based diet and settled lifestyle. She lives in a permanent timber longhouse, part of a large, interconnected community that trades pottery and polished stone axes across great distances. To her, the tales of the wild, dark-skinned people of the distant forests might seem like legends of a different world. Meanwhile, far to the east on the open plains of modern-day Poland, a third archetype moves with an air of newfound power. This is a young Yamnaya herder, perhaps living around 4,800 years ago. He drives a small herd of sheep toward a seasonal grazing ground, his belongings loaded onto a simple wooden wagon. Genetically, he is a stark contrast to both the Western hunter and the central farmer. His skin is light, a trait nearly universal in his population. His eyes could be blue, green, or brown, a mixed palette. His hair is dark brown. Most strikingly, he stands well over 6 feet tall, a towering figure whose height is written in the steppe genes he carries. He wears woolen clothing and might have intricate tattoos marking his lineage, a son of the people who mastered the horse and the wheel. His very presence in this landscape signals a coming storm of change that will soon reach the farmer in her valley and eventually the hunter in his distant forest. These three individuals, living within a few millennia of each other, were all ancient Europeans, yet they would not have looked like countrymen. They represented three distinct genetic lineages, three separate chapters of human history playing out simultaneously on the same stage. The hunter-gatherer embodied the deep, indigenous past. The farmer represented a revolutionary new way of life that was slowly weaving itself into the fabric of the continent. The steppe herder was the vanguard of a final, transformative wave. There was no standard model. The face of ancient Europe was a vibrant, ever-shifting mosaic, a masterpiece of movement and mixture where the only constant was change itself. This complex genetic history carries a profound message for our modern world. For over a century, a dangerous myth has distorted our view of the past, a story of racial purity and superior lineages. Pseudo-historical ideas, often grouped under terms like the Aryan myth, painted a picture of a master race of light-skinned, blonde-haired conquerors from the north, supposedly the founders of all high civilization. This fiction was wielded to justify unthinkable acts of discrimination and violence. Modern archaeogenetics has not merely adjusted this story, it has dismantled it completely, brick by brick. The science reveals that the very people often pointed to as the origin of this myth, the Yamnaya steppe herders, were not a pure, isolated race. Their own DNA shows they were a mixed population, a fusion of earlier Eastern European hunter-gatherers and a people with ancestry from the Caucasus Mountains and the Iranian Plateau. They were a bridge between worlds, not a singular source. Their dramatic expansion was not the triumph of one pure bloodline over others, but the latest and most visible chapter in an endless saga of mixture. The genetic history of Europe is not a straight line of descent from a perfect ancestor. It is a braided river, a story of three foundational strands: the indigenous hunter-gatherers, the incoming Anatolian farmers, and the mobile Yamnaya twisting together, separating, and merging again over thousands of years. Every modern European carries fragments of all these ancient peoples in different proportions. The classic Nordic stereotype of tall stature, very light skin, and blonde hair is not an ancient universal archetype. It is a specific combination that coalesced quite recently, and only in certain northern regions where high levels of steppe ancestry mixed with local populations over generations. It is one outcome among countless others in the grand experiment of human migration. To look for racial purity in the ancient past is to search for a ghost. The DNA evidence is unequivocal. Our ancestors were travelers, mixers, and adapters. Their legacy is not purity but profound and resilient diversity. The true story written in our genes is far more interesting and human than any simplistic myth. It is a narrative of connection, of shared journeys, and of a common heritage that reminds us the divisions we build are fleeting, while the mixtures that made us are eternal. The vibrant portraits emerging from ancient DNA feel astonishingly real, yet they come with a quiet footnote of scientific humility. These reconstructions are not snapshots, but meticulously calculated probabilities. When a geneticist examines an ancient genome, they are not reading a simple list of traits like a recipe. Instead, they compare the individual's genetic code to massive modern databases called reference panels. These panels contain genetic information from thousands of living people whose physical traits we already know. The process asks a statistical question. Given this ancient person's genetic markers for skin pigmentation, what is the most likely appearance of someone in our reference database who shares this same genetic signature? The answer is expressed as a percentage, a confidence level. For Cheddar man, the analysis might show a 95% probability of dark to black skin and a 75% chance of blue eyes. This is not guesswork but robust statistical modeling. It means that while we can be very confident about the broad strokes, there remains a small window for other possibilities. These predictions grow more complex with traits governed by many genes. Height, for instance, is influenced by hundreds of genetic variants, each with a tiny effect, plus environmental factors like childhood nutrition that leave no trace in DNA. The ancient genome can give us a genetic height potential, but we cannot know if illness or hardship during growth prevented that individual from reaching it. Even eye color, which seems straightforward, involves interactions between several genes. A person might carry the primary variant for blue eyes, but another, rarer gene could modify the outcome toward green or hazel. This is why scientists carefully describe their findings as likely or probable. They are painting with the most accurate palette available, but they acknowledge that a few subtle shades might be lost to time. The true appearance of an ancient individual also includes elements forever beyond our reach: the weathering of a lifetime spent outdoors, the scars from encounters or illnesses, the unique expressions that animated their face. The reconstructions we see are thus a powerful collaboration between the certainty of bone, the probability of genetics, and the informed empathy of the artist, reminding us that the past, while knowable, always retains a whisper of mystery. The power to reconstruct our ancestors comes with profound responsibility. As the science of ancient DNA has illuminated our shared past, it has also ignited essential conversations about ethics, ownership, and the very soul of this work. These bones are not merely data points. They are the physical remains of once living individuals, and for many communities around the world, they are revered ancestors with deep cultural and spiritual significance. A core challenge in this field is navigating the relationship between scientific inquiry and cultural respect. In regions like Europe, where direct cultural continuity over thousands of years is complex to trace, researchers still grapple with questions of consent. Who has the right to grant permission to study someone who lived 10,000 years ago? The emerging best practice is to move beyond a model of simple extraction, where scientists take samples and leave, toward one of collaboration and partnership. This means engaging with local communities, descendant groups where they can be identified, and cultural heritage organizations from the very beginning of a project. It involves listening, sharing knowledge, and ensuring that the research questions and outcomes have relevance and benefit beyond academic journals. This collaborative spirit helps ensure that the stories written in DNA are told with nuance and respect, honoring the legacy of those being studied. Closely linked to this is the vital issue of repatriation. Museums and institutions worldwide hold vast collections of human remains, many gathered during colonial eras without the consent of living peoples. The movement to return these ancestors to their communities for respectful care, according to traditional practices, is a powerful and necessary correction. For genetic science, this creates a delicate balance. While ancient DNA can provide irreplaceable insights, it cannot come at the cost of further harm or disregard for community wishes. Ethical frameworks now often require that DNA sampling be considered a last resort, used only when it answers a significant question that cannot be addressed another way, and always with the utmost care for the material. Perhaps the most dangerous shadow cast by this technology is its potential misuse. Genetic data, stripped of its careful context, can be weaponized. We have seen throughout history how simplistic interpretations of biology have been twisted to fuel nationalist narratives, to claim ancient lands, or to argue for the superiority of one group over another. The detailed map of European ancestry, with its waves of migration and constant mixing, is a direct rebuttal to any myth of racial purity. Yet, there is a risk that someone might point to the high proportion of Yamnaya ancestry in a region and declare incorrectly that this makes one group more authentically European than another. This is a profound distortion of the science, which shows that all modern populations are blends. Responsible researchers have a duty to communicate their findings with clarity, emphasizing that our genes tell a story of connection and movement, not of fixed, ancient borders. They must actively work to prevent their data from being used to sow division. The true goal of this science is not to rank or divide, but to understand the incredible journey of humanity. It is a story that belongs to everyone, a reminder that our shared history is written in a language of mixture and adaptation. By conducting this work with ethical rigor, humility, and a commitment to collaboration, we ensure that the faces we reconstruct from the past are not just scientific models, but honored guests in a conversation across time. So where does this leave the modern face of Europe? The genetic journey has revealed a clear and elegant pattern, a story told in 3 distinct chapters that have blended into a single living heritage. The complex mosaic we have traced can be distilled into a powerful model, a foundational truth of European ancestry. Every person living in Europe today carries a unique genetic mixture derived from 3 ancient populations, each with its own history and physical legacy. The first layer belongs to the indigenous Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, the original pioneers who recolonized the continent after the ice retreated. Their genetic contribution is most prominent in the far north and northeast of Europe, and they gifted later populations with the striking possibility of blue eyes, a trait that evolved independently on their long journey. The second layer arrived with the dawn of agriculture, brought by Neolithic farmers migrating from Anatolia. They introduced a settled way of life and the genetic variants for lighter skin tones that became advantageous under northern skies and a grain-based diet. Their influence is strongest around the Mediterranean. The final, transformative layer came from the east with the Bronze Age Yamnaya pastoralists of the steppe. Their massive genetic impact is most visible in northern and central Europe, where they contributed not only a high probability of light skin, but also the genetic potential for greater height and a significant portion of the ancestry that shapes populations there today. This is not a simple replacement story, but a slow, millennia-long process of integration, conflict, and ultimately mixture. Imagine these three streams of ancestry as primary colors. The hunter-gatherers contribute a deep, ancient blue. The farmers add a warm, earthen brown. The steppe herders bring in a bright, bold gold. Across the continent, these colors mixed in different proportions, creating the rich and varied palette of modern Europe. In Scandinavia, the gold and blue might blend strongly, resulting in high frequencies of light skin, light eyes, and taller stature. In Sardinia or the Basque Country, the brown might dominate, with a stronger genetic link to those early farmers and less steppe influence, resulting in generally shorter stature and a higher likelihood of darker hair and eyes. In the British Isles, you find a robust mix of all three, with the gold of the steppe often prominent. This model explains the regional differences we see today not as markers of separate races, but as the living geography of ancient migrations. Your own face, if your roots lie in Europe, is a living map of this ancient trilogy. The curve of your brow, the shade of your iris, the tone of your skin, each is a whisper from one of these three ancient worlds. This understanding dissolves the myth of static, pure populations. There is no original European look that has been preserved in isolation. Instead, there is a dynamic, braided river of ancestry, constantly fed by these three major tributaries and countless smaller streams. We are not the end point of a single line, but the beautiful, ongoing result of a conversation that began tens of thousands of years ago. A conversation written in the language of genes and expressed in the endless variety of the human face. The final, breathtaking step in this journey is the moment science and art converge to give a face to the data. This transformation from genetic code to a living, breathing portrait is a meticulous collaboration between forensic anthropology and the new insights from ancient DNA. It begins with the most permanent record of a person, their skull. In a laboratory, an expert forensic anthropologist will study this structure with immense care. They take precise measurements of the brow ridge, the nasal aperture, the shape of the jaw, and the set of the eye sockets. These bones provide the unchanging architectural blueprint, the unique foundation upon which every other feature will be built. From this, they can determine the individual's biological sex, approximate age at their passing, and sometimes even identify signs of old injuries or health challenges they may have faced. This skeletal framework is then used to create a physical model, often through three-dimensional printing or traditional clay sculpting. But here is where the process used to rely on educated guesswork. How thick were the lips? What was the shape of the nose tip? These soft tissue details leave no trace on bone. Traditionally, artists applied average tissue depth markers based on modern population standards, which risked projecting contemporary features onto ancient faces. This is where genetic data revolutionizes the reconstruction. The ancient genome acts as a precise color guide and trait corrector. Scientists can now provide the artists with statistically informed predictions. This individual had a very high probability of dark skin. Their eyes were most likely blue, their hair was dark and curly. This genetic palette replaces assumption with evidence. The artist can select the appropriate skin tone, place eyes of the correct color, and style hair with a texture informed by the DNA. They also use the skull's own clues, like the width of the nasal opening suggesting a broader nose, or the muscle attachment points indicating a stronger jaw. The result is a face that is both scientifically grounded and hauntingly human. The reconstructions of individuals like Cheddar Man are powerful precisely because of this fusion. We are not looking at a generic model or an artist's pure imagination. We are looking at a best approximation informed by the individual's own biological instructions, layered upon the unique architecture of their own skull. These public-facing images do more than illustrate a scientific paper. They bridge a gap of millennia. They allow us to look directly into the eyes of a person from a forgotten world, challenging our preconceptions and making the abstract, statistical past feel intimately real. It is a reminder that every data point in a genetic sequence was once a living, breathing person with a story, and now we can finally begin to see them. By the dawn of the Iron Age, around 1,000 years before the Common Era, the genetic portrait of Europe had settled into a recognizable frame. The epic migrations, the great clashes and blendings of peoples had woven the three ancient strands, hunter-gatherer, farmer, and steppe herder, into a relatively stable fabric across the continent. The constant, churning turnover of populations that defined the Neolithic and Bronze Ages had slowed. Communities were more rooted, their territories more defined by emerging tribal identities and complex social hierarchies. This stability allowed the genetic traits carried by their ancestors to finally settle into the patterns we can still see on a map today. The modern palette of European appearance was, for the first time, coming sharply into focus. In the sun-drenched south around the Mediterranean basin, populations retained a higher proportion of ancestry from the early Anatolian farmers. Here, the genetic tendency leaned toward darker hair, a higher frequency of brown eyes, and skin tones that were, on average, slightly darker than their northern neighbors, a practical adaptation to stronger sunlight that also reflected a deeper genetic link to those first agricultural pioneers. Travel north and the influence of the Yamnaya steppe ancestry grew stronger. In the forests and plains of Central and Northern Europe, the genetic instructions for very light skin had become nearly universal, a clear legacy of those pastoralists from the east. Lighter eyes shades of blue, green, and gray became common features, a fascinating merger of the ancient blue eye variant from the hunter-gatherers and the demographic power of the steppe populations who carried and spread it. Hair color presented its own diverse mosaic. Dark brown remained prevalent everywhere, but the genetic variants for blonde and red hair, which had arisen and been carried along by these great movements, now found their stronghold. Blonde hair became particularly associated with the Baltic and Scandinavian regions, while the unique genetic signature for red hair, though always rare, persisted in isolated pockets, its future cultural fame waiting in the wings of history. This does not mean every village was uniform. Local variation was the rule. A Celtic tribe in Gaul might have a different mix than a Germanic tribe near the Rhine, their distinct histories reflected in slight shifts in the frequency of traits. Trade, small-scale raids, and the slow exchange of marriage partners between groups meant genes still flowed, preventing any population from becoming completely isolated or static. The Iron Age face of Europe was not a finished painting, but a vibrant watercolor where the major colors had finally been laid down, their borders softly blending but their regional dominance clear. This was the human landscape that would witness the rise of Rome, the great folk migrations of late antiquity, and all the historical events that shaped the recorded world. The foundation was set, the ancient genetic revolutions were over, and the long, intricate process of fine-tuning within a stabilized palette had begun. Genetics can map the journey of a people, but it cannot tell us the stories they told around the fire. A crucial, humbling truth emerges from this flood of ancient data. The genes for skin color, eye color, or height are not a barcode for culture, language, or identity. They are a biological signature, one single thread in the infinitely richer tapestry of a human life. An individual carrying a high proportion of Yamnaya steppe ancestry, buried with a bronze dagger in Britain, might not have spoken a word of a Proto-Indo-European language. They could have been a child of immigrants who fully adopted the local Celtic tongue, worshipping local gods and following local customs. Their genes marked a journey their ancestors made, but their heart and mind belonged to the community that raised them. Conversely, a person whose DNA showed mostly Anatolian farmer ancestry might have lived a life utterly transformed from their forebears, perhaps as a nomadic herder on the open plains, having embraced the very pastoralist lifestyle their genetic cousins once replaced. Culture is learned, shared, and constantly reinvented. It flows across genetic boundaries with a fluidity that DNA can never capture. Language, perhaps the most profound marker of human identity, spreads through contact, trade, conquest, and choice, not just through biological descent. The Celtic languages, for instance, are historically associated with peoples carrying significant steppe ancestry, but that does not mean the language was a direct, unbroken genetic heirloom from the Yamnaya. It could have been adopted by communities with very different genetic backgrounds because it was useful, prestigious, or simply the language of their neighbors. The tapestry of history is woven from many materials: the artifacts people crafted, the homes they built, the words they spoke, the beliefs they held sacred, and yes, the genes they passed on. To focus on genetics alone is to try to understand a symphony by listening to only the cellos. You will hear a beautiful, essential part of the music, but you will miss the melody carried by the violins, the rhythm of the percussion, and the harmony of the woodwinds. The true story of our past is found in the concert of all these elements. Our ancient ancestors were not just carriers of traits, they were thinkers, artists, parents, and explorers whose identities were forged in the crucible of daily life, in the choices they made and the traditions they built. The color of their skin tells us about adaptation, but the tools they left behind tell us about ingenuity. Their burial rites tell us about belief. Their pottery tells us about community. To reduce them to a genetic profile is to miss the very essence of their humanity and our own. This scientific revelation, then, is not an end but a new beginning, an invitation to see the past in all its breathtaking, complex, and wonderfully human fullness. This genetic symphony plays out most clearly in the quiet corners of the map, in populations whose long isolation preserved echoes of ancient worlds. Two remarkable examples, the Sami of the Arctic North and the Sardinians of the Mediterranean, stand as living archives of Europe's forgotten past, each telling a starkly different chapter of the story. Their distinct genetic signatures act like time capsules, offering a direct glimpse into what some of our ancestors truly looked like before the great blendings reshaped the continent. The Sami, indigenous to the northern reaches of Scandinavia and the Kola Peninsula, carry a genetic legacy that sets them apart from all their European neighbors. Their ancestry reveals a profound and ancient connection not to the Western hunter-gatherers or the Yamnaya, but to peoples from Siberia. A significant portion of their genetic makeup links them to populations from the Ural Mountains and beyond, reflecting a deep history of movement along the Arctic Rim, a separate migratory pathway into the far north. This unique heritage suggests their historical appearance was adapted to an extreme environment. Their genetic profile indicates a likelihood of lighter skin, a practical adaptation to the high latitude, but their eye and hair color likely presented a mix, with darker shades being common. Their physical stature tended to be shorter, a possible adaptation to conserving heat in a brutally cold climate. For centuries, their nomadic reindeer herding lifestyle and remote homeland insulated them from the genetic tides that swept through southern Scandinavia, allowing them to preserve this unique Siberian thread in the European tapestry. They are not a relic of the first Europeans, but a testament to a completely different ancient journey into the continent, a story written in the cold light of the Arctic. Far to the south, on the rugged island of Sardinia, a different kind of preservation occurred. Here, the genetic clock seems to have slowed. Sardinians today retain the highest proportion of early Neolithic farmer ancestry in all of Europe, a direct link to those first agricultural pioneers from Anatolia. Their genome is a museum of that ancient wave, with only a modest contribution from the later Yamnaya steppe migrations that so dramatically altered the mainland. This remarkable isolation, born of the island's mountainous terrain and geographic separation, means the genetic blueprint for appearance in Sardinia tells a story that is thousands of years closer to those first farmers. Based on this ancestry, the traditional Sardinian population would have historically exhibited features tied to that early Mediterranean world. Skin tones were likely somewhat lighter than the original hunter-gatherers, but still darker on average than populations in northern Europe. Eyes were predominantly brown and hair was overwhelmingly dark. Their average height was also shorter, a characteristic common among early agricultural societies. The Sardinian genetic profile is like a snapshot of southern Europe before the steppe expansion reached its full intensity, a preserved fragment of the continent's second major genetic layer. The existence of these two populations underscores a beautiful and complex truth. There is no single ancient European look to rediscover. Instead, the past was a continent of many faces, shaped by different journeys, different environments, and different choices. The Sami and the Sardinians, through their historical separation, guarded distinct pages from the same epic book. One page tells of Arctic migrations and Siberian horizons, the other of early farmers finding a permanent home on a sun-drenched island. Their genetics are not curiosities but crucial keys, reminding us that our shared history is not a straight road, but a vast and branching tree, and some of its oldest limbs still quietly reach into the present. Even with this revolutionary map, vast territories of our past remain uncharted. The broad strokes are now clear, but the fine details, the intimate portraits of daily life and individual variation, still hide in the shadows of prehistory. Some of the most compelling questions are about the very traits we often associate with ancient northern Europe. We know the genetic ingredients for blonde hair were present and mixing during the Bronze Age, but the precise recipe for its modern distribution is still being decoded. Where exactly did this suite of alleles coalesce into a common feature? And was it a slow drift across populations or a rapid spread driven by a powerful cultural preference? The story of red hair is even more elusive, its rare genetic spark flickering in ancient genomes but never blazing into a widespread trait until much later in isolated regions. These are not just questions of curiosity, they are puzzles about how culture and chance can amplify a single genetic whisper into a defining characteristic of a people. Beyond the palette of color lies the even more complex architecture of the face. While we can read the genes for pigmentation, reconstructing the precise shape of a nose, the fullness of lips, or the unique set of a jaw from genetics alone remains one of the grand challenges of the field. Our facial structure is governed by a symphony of hundreds, perhaps thousands of genes, each playing a tiny note. Disentangling this symphony to understand which genetic variations lead to which specific features is a monumental task that requires analyzing millions of modern and ancient genomes side by side. Future research promises to move beyond averages, to understand how these genes interacted in a single individual to create a face that was truly their own, a face loved and recognized by their community. Then there are the invisible sculptors of the body, health and nourishment. Ancient DNA can tell us a person's genetic potential for height, but it cannot reveal if childhood illness or periods of scarcity stunted their growth. We see the decline in average height with the adoption of farming, a trend linked to a less varied diet and the challenges of settled life. But we are only beginning to understand the specific nutritional deficiencies or health challenges that shaped these ancient bodies. By analyzing not just human DNA, but also the genetic remnants of pathogens preserved in ancient teeth and bone, scientists are starting to reconstruct the landscape of disease these communities faced. How did outbreaks reshape populations? How did recurring illness affect physical development and, in turn, the genetic legacy passed forward? These are profound questions that connect our biology directly to the hardships and resilience of daily existence in a world without modern medicine. The path forward is illuminated by the very technology that brought us here. The next great leaps will come from filling in the blank spaces on the map and the timeline. This means dedicated efforts to recover and sequence ancient DNA from regions that have been understudied, like the rugged interior of the Balkans, the coastlines of North Africa, and the forest zones of Eastern Europe. Each new genome from these areas is a missing piece, potentially revealing entirely unknown migrations or long isolated populations that add new colors to our tapestry. It also requires building a denser timeline, analyzing skeletons from every few centuries instead of every millennium, to watch genetic changes unfold in real time, to see exactly when a new trait arrived in a valley and how quickly it spread. With each new skeleton that yields its secrets, the static portraits of the past gain animation. We begin to see not just what these people looked like, but how they changed, how they moved, and how they lived. The story is far from over. It is being written anew with every discovery, inviting us to look deeper into the mirror of time and see the endless, beautiful complexity of our shared human journey. The story is not locked away in a museum, it is written in the mirror. If your own heritage traces back to Europe, you are a living testament to this ancient trilogy. Every person of European descent carries within their cells a unique mosaic, fragments of DNA inherited from those three foundational peoples, the hunter-gatherers, the farmers, and the steppe herders. Your own appearance, from the shade of your skin to the color of your eyes, is a direct reflection of the specific proportions of that ancient mixture passed down through thousands of generations. This is not abstract history, it is personal biology. Your genome is a palimpsest, a document where the writings of these ancient populations have been layered, one over the other, to create the singular story of you. The regional differences we see across Europe today are not random. They are the geographic footprints of those old migrations, frozen in time by centuries of relative stability. In Scandinavia, for instance, the genetic influence from the Yamnaya steppe herders is exceptionally strong. This high proportion of steppe ancestry correlates with the very high frequencies of light skin, light eyes, and taller average stature common in that region. It is the living echo of that Bronze Age expansion, a genetic signature that found a lasting home in the north, traveled to the island of Sardinia, and the story shifts. Here, the genetic clock ticked more slowly. The steep mountains and surrounding sea created a natural fortress, limiting the influx of later migrations. As a result, modern Sardinians retain the highest level of early Neolithic farmer ancestry in Europe. This is why traits common in that ancient population, darker hair, a higher frequency of brown eyes, and a shorter average height, remain so prominent there today. It is a preserved snapshot of Europe's second act. In the British Isles, you find a robust blend of all three sources, with a particularly strong steppe signal alongside significant farmer and some hunter-gatherer ancestry. This complex blend explains the wide spectrum of appearances found there, from very light features to darker hair and eyes, all existing within the same population. It is a genetic reflection of an island that was a final destination for multiple waves of people. Even within a single country, these gradients exist. In Spain, for example, studies show a subtle but measurable increase in hunter-gatherer ancestry in the northern Basque region compared to the south, a quiet whisper of ancient refuges and later settlement patterns. This means that your family's more specific regional origins within Europe can often be linked to slight variations in this ancient recipe. The science allows us to move beyond vague notions of nationality and see the deeper, older layers of identity written in our biology. You are not just from a modern nation, you are from a specific point on this ancient genetic map, a place where these three great rivers of ancestry met and mingled in a proportion unique to your lineage. This understanding dissolves the myth of pure, static populations. There is no original European look that has been perfectly preserved. Instead, we are all dynamic composites walking archives of an epic journey. The next time you look at a crowd in a European city, see not separate groups but a living gallery of human history. The person with very light skin and blue eyes carries a strong chapter from the eastern steppes. The person with dark hair and brown eyes may hold a deeper thread from the early farmers of Anatolia. And in every face, especially in those with combinations that defy simple categories, you see the beautiful, endless results of mixture. This genetic legacy is a gift of profound connection, a reminder that our differences are not divisions but variations on a deeply shared theme. The faces of our ancestors are not lost. They are reflected in ours, a continuous, unbroken line from the depths of prehistory to the present moment, written in the most personal language imaginable, the language of life itself. This genetic journey through time reveals a portrait in constant motion. The face of ancient Europe was never a single, fixed image, but a dynamic masterpiece painted by three great migrations. It was shaped by the dark-skinned hunter-gatherers who survived the ice, the lighter-skinned farmers who seeded a new way of life, and the tall steppe herders whose arrival rewrote the genetic landscape. Their stories did not unfold in sequence, but in parallel, creating a continent where, for millennia, people who looked nothing like one another shared the same forests, valleys, and skies. The classic stereotypes we might hold about ancient peoples, the uniform tribes of light-skinned northerners or dark-haired southerners, are modern simplifications projected onto a past far more colorful and strange. The true takeaway is one of breathtaking diversity across both time and space. An individual living in Wales 10,000 years ago would have borne little physical resemblance to someone in Anatolia at the same moment, and neither would look exactly like their own descendants a few thousand years later. Our ancestors were travelers, adapters, and relentless mixers. This understanding does more than satisfy historical curiosity. It fundamentally reshapes how we see human history itself. It replaces a narrative of isolated, pure lineages with one of profound and endless interconnection. The divisions we sometimes emphasize today are fleeting when viewed against this deep time tapestry of mixture. Our shared past is a story written not in separation, but in coming together, a reminder that the very concept of static racial categories collapses under the weight of genetic evidence. This science invites us to look at our own reflection and the faces of those around us with new eyes, not as representatives of fixed types, but as living, breathing chapters in an epic, ongoing story of human movement and resilience. The next time you wonder about the past, remember that its secrets are still being read, one ancient genome at a time, urging us to see our common heritage in every shade and feature.